It started with a single HOA complaint. Harmless, almost laughable. But when Karen escalated, filing dozens of false reports, what seemed minor quickly spiraled into a full-blown neighborhood war with shocking consequences. Let me start from beginning. The neighborhood seemed peaceful at first glance. Manicured lawns stretching like ribbons of green. Sidewalks lined with flowering shrubs. Mailboxes standing like sentinels outside every pristine home. From the outside, it was the kind of street people dreamed about. Quiet, orderly, and well-kept. Families waved to each other during evening strolls. Dogs barked in cheerful, controlled bursts, and the faint hum of sprinklers served as a soothing soundtrack to suburban life. But beneath that facade, something was brewing. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A single letter slipped under the doormat of one unsuspecting homeowner. The letter bore the familiar HOA insignia and outlined a violation of community guidelines. An accusation that a minor decorative feature on the porch violated the rules. The tone was formal, cold, and yet somehow pointed, designed to unsettle. The homeowner read it, confused. The supposed violation was a small, tasteful garden gnome tucked discreetly behind the roses, a fixture that had been in the same spot for years without issue. But the HOA letter was definitive, as if someone had been watching, waiting for an excuse to complain. At first, it felt like a mistake. Errors happen. People misread rules. Then came the second letter, and the third. Each complaint was stranger than the last. An umbrella left out after sunset, the angle of a flag on a pole, the pattern of bricks on a walkway. All petty, all seemingly inconsequential. Yet, the accumulation suggested a pattern. Someone was taking the role of enforcer far more seriously than was reasonable. The homeowner began to notice her neighbor, a woman named Karen, more often than before. Karen moved with purpose, surveying each lawn and porch with a hawk-like scrutiny. Her eyes would linger, taking in details most people overlooked. She was always impeccably dressed, her posture perfect, and her expression unreadable. A subtle combination of authority and menace. And she was always smiling. There were whispers among the neighbors, small murmurs exchanged over fences and during the occasional casual chat while walking dogs. Have you noticed the letters? I think Karen's been busy again. But no one confronted her directly. In this neighborhood, confrontation was frowned upon. The HOA held a sway over every detail of life here, and Karen wielded her influence quietly but effectively. The homeowner tried to ignore the letters at first. She meticulously corrected every alleged violation, often going above and beyond, trimming shrubs, straightening ornaments, and rearranging decorative items according to the exact specifications laid out in HOA guidelines. She began documenting everything with photos and timestamps, partly out of frustration, partly out of a sense that this was becoming more than just casual oversight. It was not long before the pattern became undeniable. Karen filed complaint after complaint, each one increasingly unreasonable. A new complaint arrived almost every week, citing issues so minor they seemed almost comical to anyone with a sense of proportion. But the HOA didn't dismiss them. Instead, they treated each submission seriously, sending notices, fines, and follow-ups. The homeowner's life began to change. Weekends, once filled with relaxation and family time, became hours of meticulously cleaning, rearranging, and photographing property, preparing evidence to counter the relentless letters. Stress mounted. Sleep became fragmented. The constant intrusion into daily life started to feel like harassment, but subtle, legal, and deliberate. Other neighbors noticed the tension. Some were quietly sympathetic, having witnessed Karen's scrutiny firsthand. Others were wary, afraid that any sign of dissent might trigger similar complaints. Karen's power was amplified by the HOA's unquestioning enforcement of the rules. She had created an invisible network of surveillance, and it was exhausting to be under its gaze. The homeowner decided to take a more structured approach. She began documenting everything meticulously: dates, times, photos of the alleged violations, and cross-references to HOA rules. She also started noting patterns: how complaints were timed, how Karen's attention seemed focused, and how she personally seemed to monitor the property with obsessive diligence. Every small interaction became data in a growing record of harassment. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents anymore. It was systematic. Karen was using the HOA to micromanage her neighbor's life, weaponizing rules that were meant to maintain fairness and order, twisting them into tools for personal vendetta. Each notice was accompanied by a subtle reminder of the HOA's authority, the implication that resistance would lead to escalating consequences. By this point, the homeowner realized that responding emotionally would only fuel the cycle. Patience and meticulous evidence gathering were the only defenses against Karen's relentless attacks. And, as she pored over the growing stack of documents, photos, and records, she recognized an opportunity. What Karen had failed to anticipate was that her own meticulousness could be turned against her. The realization was both frightening and empowering. The homeowner understood that every letter, every complaint, and every unreasonable fine became a piece of evidence in a larger story, one that could be used to hold Karen accountable. But before moving forward, there was a careful strategy to be planned. Every detail mattered: timing, documentation, legality. She could not afford to misstep. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign, oblivious to the fact that the target of her harassment was quietly turning the tables. The homeowner's preparation grew more sophisticated, including spreadsheets to track complaint frequency, photo logs, timestamps, and HOA communications. Each new complaint became an entry in a growing archive. Neighbors began to take notice of the mounting tension. The story, while silent and unseen in many ways, was no longer private. There were subtle discussions at the neighborhood park, cautious advice exchanged over backyard fences. The dynamic of the street had shifted. Karen's unchecked authority was meeting a quiet, relentless resistance, and it was beginning to rattle the foundations of her influence. The homeowner even began consulting legal resources, reading about harassment law, HOA governance, and precedent cases where residents had successfully challenged overzealous neighbors. The process was tedious, complex, and often discouraging, but the alternative, continued subjugation to Karen's relentless scrutiny, was unacceptable. The first chapter of the conflict was ending not with confrontation but with preparation. A storm was brewing beneath the serene surface of the neighborhood. Karen had escalated her complaints to the point of obsession, but the homeowner had recognized the pattern and was preparing for the inevitable clash. Every piece of evidence collected, every photo taken, every rule cited, would soon form the backbone of a strategy that Karen could never have anticipated. And so, as the sun set on another meticulously maintained suburban street, the quiet war continued. But this time, one side was gathering strength, patience, and undeniable proof. The next chapter would see the first real blows delivered, not with letters or fines, but with legal precision and mounting consequences. The once quiet street had transformed into a stage for an invisible battle. Where neighbors once waved and exchanged pleasantries, there was now an undercurrent of caution. People looked over their shoulders, aware that any minor infraction could trigger scrutiny from the woman who had become the neighborhood's self-appointed authority. Karen's presence had always been intimidating, but now it carried an added weight. The knowledge that she had the ear of the HOA, and that she wielded it with precision and intent. For the homeowner, life had grown more strategic than social. Mornings began with meticulous observation of the yard. Each plant, each decoration, each outdoor object placed and recorded. Cameras, simple, discreet ones, were installed to capture interactions and movements around the property. Every potential complaint from Karen was now anticipated, every minor detail considered as a possible weapon in her campaign of harassment. Karen escalated her efforts in subtle, almost theatrical ways. Letters became more frequent, arriving with astonishing punctuality. The same day of the week, the same time, as if timed to maximize stress. Notices were framed in language that was unnervingly formal, almost ritualistic. Even seemingly trivial items, like a slightly tilted welcome mat, were cataloged as violations. The homeowner realized quickly that Karen's obsession had grown from mere annoyance to a methodical exercise in domination. It was during this period that the homeowner discovered the true nature of Karen's influence. She had allies within the HOA, people who acted not out of malice but out of fear of confrontation. Each complaint was accepted at face value, as if Karen's reports were gospel. The HOA became a silent partner in harassment, enforcing rules selectively while turning a blind eye to the absurdity of the violations. The system itself had been weaponized. As the weeks turned into months, the homeowner's preparations intensified. Each complaint from Karen was meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and analyzed. Patterns emerged. The time of day, Karen submitted complaints. The tendency to file multiple notices simultaneously. The targeting of items that had never been flagged before. Each entry in the growing archive became evidence of harassment, a narrative that would later serve as undeniable proof. Neighbors whispered about the tension, their casual remarks hinting at awareness of the growing feud. A few dared to sympathize openly, noting how Karen seemed to patrol the street with a calculated vigilance. Others, fearful of becoming targets themselves, kept their distance. The neighborhood was quietly divided, tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The homeowner's strategy evolved beyond mere documentation. Legal research became a daily routine. She pored over community guidelines, state statutes, and prior HOA case law. She learned the exact language needed to challenge harassment claims and how to present evidence in a way that was compelling, credible, and irrefutable. She studied timelines, photographed every inch of her property, and created a meticulous log of Karen's activities. This was not just about winning against one neighbor. It was about exposing a pattern of abuse that the HOA itself had facilitated. Karen, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the growing counter-strategy. She increased her surveillance, wandering past windows under the guise of casual walks, snapping photos, and recording every perceived infraction. Her meticulousness became her vulnerability. Each obsessive act was now being captured, time-stamped, and cataloged. The very tools she used to intimidate were being turned against her. One particularly tense morning, the homeowner noticed a subtle shift. Karen had left a small note on the porch, a complaint about the orientation of a single potted plant. The note was as precise and formal as previous complaints, but this time the homeowner had already anticipated it. Photographs showed that the plant had been perfectly aligned weeks earlier. The note, meant to intimidate, instead became part of the mounting evidence of obsessive harassment. The homeowner's growing confidence was not misplaced. With each complaint filed, the case against Karen solidified. Legal counsel confirmed that repeated documented harassment, even under the guise of HOA complaints, was actionable. It was no longer just a personal feud. It had become a clear, provable pattern of harassment that could not be ignored. The homeowner was building a case that was airtight. Meanwhile, Karen's aggression escalated. Complaints began to include neighbors' perceptions, exaggerations, and sometimes outright fabrications. Notices were copied to other residents, subtly signaling that the homeowner was under constant scrutiny, isolated in the theater of enforcement. Yet each new attempt to intimidate only provided more evidence of harassment. The tension on the street became palpable. Mailboxes seemed like battlegrounds. Even a single misplaced object could trigger a chain reaction. Families adjusted routines, timing walks and gardening activities to avoid Karen's scrutiny. Yet the homeowner continued to operate methodically, never reacting emotionally, always documenting, always preparing. Months passed. The archives grew thicker, more detailed, more damning. Complaints, photographs, timelines, neighbor observations, every element became part of a legal narrative. The homeowner had anticipated every possible counterargument, every loophole Karen might exploit. The strategy was clear. Prove that the harassment was intentional, repetitive, and detrimental, not merely incidental or subjective. Finally, the day arrived when the evidence was complete. The homeowner, armed with a comprehensive record of every complaint, every notice, and every overreach, prepared to confront Karen legally. The process was deliberate, methodical, and careful. Legal counsel drafted notices, calculated potential damages, and outlined a strategy that would expose not only Karen's harassment, but also the HOA's complicity. The homeowner understood that the stakes were high. This was not just about vindication. It was about accountability, justice, and setting a precedent that would prevent others from being subjected to similar abuse. The first formal legal step was taken. Notices were sent, complaints filed in official channels, and the homeowner's documentation presented with clarity, precision, and undeniable force. It was the moment when the quiet, simmering tension of months transformed into an open, legal confrontation. Karen's reaction, while predictable, could no longer escalate without consequences. The homeowner had removed the element of surprise and gained a clear strategic advantage. The neighborhood watched with bated breath. Conversations shifted from casual whispers to speculation about the outcome. People speculated about fines, potential settlements, and the HOA's role in enabling the harassment. Karen's once commanding presence on the street began to waver, her aura of invincibility challenged by the meticulous, strategic response of the homeowner she had sought to dominate. And yet, the drama was far from over. While the homeowner had successfully turned the tide, the story was only beginning to reach its climax. The HOA, unprepared for the legal and financial ramifications of Karen's campaign, faced scrutiny they had never anticipated. Legal letters, demands for accountability, and meticulously documented evidence had transformed a private feud into a public, financial, and legal spectacle. By the end of this phase, the balance of power had shifted. Karen, who had once seemed untouchable, was now under investigation, her actions catalogued in precise detail. The HOA, previously a silent enabler, faced the reality that its policies and enforcement practices could have serious consequences. The homeowner, calm, prepared, and patient, had orchestrated a counteroffensive that would soon yield results far beyond simple vindication. And as the sun set once more over the manicured lawns and quiet streets, it was clear that the next chapter would bring resolution, but not without a dramatic reckoning. The neighborhood, once a tableau of peace and order, had become a theater of justice, strategy, and carefully documented retribution. The neighborhood had transformed completely. What had started as a quiet, orderly street with trimmed hedges and white picket fences now carried a tension that was palpable in every interaction. Conversations were cautious. Neighbors glanced at each other with subtle concern, and the once unquestioned authority of Karen had begun to erode. The homeowner, calm but resolute, had spent months meticulously documenting every single complaint, every tiny infraction alleged, and every act of obsessive surveillance Karen had conducted. It was now time to transform preparation into action. Legal filings were submitted with precision, citing harassment, abuse of HOA processes, and the deliberate targeting of a resident through false claims. The homeowner had built an airtight case, and the sheer weight of evidence left no room for dismissal. Every letter Karen had sent, every photograph she had taken, and every HOA notice that had followed her complaints was laid out chronologically, demonstrating a relentless, pattern-based campaign of harassment. The HOA, which had previously enforced Karen's complaints unquestioningly, suddenly found itself in an unprecedented position. Board members had underestimated the consequences of blindly following one neighbor's obsessive attention to detail. Legal notices pointed to the board's complicity, highlighting the financial and ethical risks of failing to investigate complaints thoroughly. Suddenly, the same organization that had once given Karen power now had to confront the reality that they, too, were accountable. As the legal process unfolded, the homeowner remained methodical and composed. The narrative of harassment was undeniable, supported by timestamps, photographic evidence, and testimony from other neighbors who had observed Karen's obsessive scrutiny. Even those who had been hesitant to speak before now came forward quietly, providing corroboration without needing to confront Karen directly. Her power of intimidation was weakened, her surveillance rendered impotent by the relentless documentation. Karen herself was shocked by the turn of events. Her letters and complaints, once feared, now served as her own undoing. Every obsessive note, every trivial violation she had reported had become evidence of a pattern designed to intimidate and control. The homeowner had flipped the narrative entirely. What had been intended as domination through bureaucratic means was now a case study in harassment law, an example of how excessive enforcement could backfire spectacularly. Negotiations with the HOA began quietly. Board members, faced with the potential for costly litigation and reputational damage, were suddenly eager to settle. Their previous loyalty to Karen and the rigid enforcement of community rules gave way to pragmatism. The homeowner's detailed evidence and strategic legal positioning created leverage that could not be ignored. The letters, once a source of stress, were now tools of accountability. Finally, the settlement arrived. Karen was held accountable for her harassment. The HOA was required to cover legal fees, totaling thousands of dollars, not only as a consequence of her overreach, but as a statement about the misuse of authority. The homeowner had transformed months of relentless scrutiny, stress, and planning into a decisive victory. The narrative that had once been dominated by Karen's obsessive control was now being told entirely from the perspective of resilience, patience, and careful strategy. The neighborhood's reaction was mixed, but quietly supportive. Some residents admitted they had always suspected Karen's obsession, but had been too intimidated to intervene. Others felt vindicated, seeing that overzealous enforcement could have real consequences. Conversations in driveways and along sidewalks shifted from fear to cautious reflection. The HOA, chastened and more vigilant, reviewed its policies to prevent future misuse of authority. What had once been a tool of intimidation became a cautionary tale, a story of accountability that would linger in the neighborhood's collective memory. The homeowner, though victorious, felt a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and reflection. Months of careful documentation, legal research, and unwavering patience had paid off, yet the process had exacted a toll. Sleep, peace of mind, and the tranquility of a simple neighborhood life had been sacrificed for the sake of justice. But the triumph was undeniable. The cycle of harassment had been broken, and accountability had been firmly established. Karen, once the self-appointed arbiter of perfection, found herself sidelined, her influence diminished, her reputation tarnished. The meticulous complaints, obsessive scrutiny, and attempts at control had ultimately failed because they had been systematically documented and challenged. Her authority, once unquestioned, had crumbled under the weight of evidence and legal scrutiny. For the homeowner, the story became an emblem of what can happen when persistence meets preparation. The HOA's role in facilitating Karen's harassment was exposed, and the financial repercussions served as a tangible reminder that rules, when misused, can carry serious consequences. The neighborhood slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, though the undercurrent of awareness remained. Residents had learned that vigilance was necessary, not just over their property, but over those who claimed authority. In the aftermath, the story spread. Neighbors discussed the case in hushed tones and online forums, analyzing every step, every detail. It became a modern tale of suburban warfare, one where patience, strategy, and evidence overcame intimidation and obsessive control. What had started as minor complaints and letters evolved into a narrative of empowerment, legal insight, and accountability. By the end of the ordeal, the neighborhood had changed in subtle but lasting ways. The HOA became more cautious in enforcing minor complaints, board members were more diligent in reviewing reports, and residents learned that even in the seemingly perfect suburban idyll, vigilance and preparation were essential. The homeowner's victory was more than personal. It was symbolic. It demonstrated that careful, methodical action could counter harassment, turn the tide against overreach, and establish boundaries that even the most obsessed neighbor could not cross. And as the sun set over the manicured lawns once again, the street returned to its appearance of calm. But beneath the surface, the lessons of accountability, resilience, and strategic thinking lingered. The homeowner had won, not with confrontation, but with patience, meticulous documentation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Karen's influence had been dismantled. The HOA had paid the price for complicity, and a quiet sense of order returned, tempered by the knowledge that power must always be balanced by responsibility. The final chapter of the feud ended not with fireworks, not with public spectacle, but with the quiet, undeniable triumph of careful strategy over obsessive control. The street, once a stage for intimidation, had become a testament to the power of preparation, patience, and unwavering resolve. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.